Hello, my name is Alex Thompson. I am a graduating senior at Blind Brook High School, and I'm affiliated with the Miami Forest Preserve through their wildlife technician program. I'm going to talk about acoustic monitoring of anurans at a suburban forest area. So to start, in recent times, anurans are one of the most highly threatened groupings of vertebrate animals for extinction. This has become so much of a threat that recently monitoring of them has increased as a way to preserve their populations within environments that they're in, or look at certain species richness or other factors that might be contributing to their decline. This is supported by one study by Stewart et al. That found that 48%, or nearly the majority of all anuran species, are considered to be in rapid decline. One method of monitoring that's been increasing in popularity for anurans is called acoustic monitoring, and this is if you can find if a species is in an environment or not, based on if species-specific calls that they emit can be heard. And it's been growing in popularity with better technology for recording. And one study by Mizzi et al. Found that acoustic monitoring has been heavily used on birds and bats, though its use on anurans is still relatively new, so there needs to be more studies done on using it for anurans to make sure it's reliable. And finally, what's important to note is that data recorded by acoustic monitoring is very good to look at certain factors that might be contributing to an animal's decline. So for example, if an animal is much more likely to call in one environment compared to another one, you can look at certain reasons, differences between the two environments to see why that might be the case. That was actually what was done in one study by Thompson et al. That also looked at anurans, where they saw that water body sizes are one of the main ways they believed anurans might be affected by different factors within their environment, as they believe sizes between 200 to 4,000 square meters were preferred by anurans for places that they would be in, for pond sites. So the purpose of this study was to look at using acoustic monitoring for anuran species to see how effective it could be at doing so, and also look at certain factors that might be contributing to anuran decline. The hypothesis that I formed for this study was that acoustic monitoring would be beneficial, or would work in doing so, looking at anuran species, and also that the two main factors that we would look at, which would be the size and type of water bodies used, the type being either a vernal pool or a permanent wetland, would also impact the calling rates of anurans in some way, or the presence rates that we detected. So the study was done at the Miami Forest Preserve in Bedford, New York. It's a very biodiverse area that's home to many different plant and animal species, which includes anurans, which is why they need to be monitored to prevent their decline. And in total, we chose 12 different pond sites in the area. You can see they're highlighted with the red crosses there, of all different types and sizes. And the sizes range between 860 to 160,000 square meters. Then I recorded all these sites using a specific recorder called developed by Wildlife Acoustics. It was called Song Meter Mini Bats, and what these did was that they recorded the initial 5 minutes of every hour between 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., or when we believed anurans would be most likely to call during the day, from March 18th to June 18th, as we believe this to be the main times anuran mating season occurred throughout our area. And that's just a picture of me sitting with the recorder there under a tree, as you can see. And then I listened to all these recordings, and for each of the different recordings that we had, I marked them down with an X. If there was no report running that day, if for some reason it may have ran out of battery or some issue might have occurred. 1 if there's a detection of a certain species, or 0 if there's no detection of that species for each of the different species that we found. I also used a specific spectrogram software called Wildlife Acoustics Light Analysis, Kaleidoscope Light Analysis, sorry. And what this allows us to do is it allows us to see sort of a visual waveform of the recordings to allow for visual analysis as well. So this is an example of what the recording would look like on the spectrogram software. And because of how specific each of the species of anurans calls are, you'd easily be able to see them in the recording. So that you can see there is actually the calling of wood frog. It's a wood frog forest. And what's important to know about that is that they always appear in very similar ways in the recording. So each of the species, when they did call very often, you'd be able to see them very easily within the recordings. And also, if there's nothing really calling for one of the recordings, that would also be very easy to see if there was virtually no sound. And then moving on to the analysis, the first thing I analyzed was the daily call proportions of each of the different species that we found. That was just looking at, for each of the days that we found, the total number of sites that an anuran species appeared in over the total number of sites that were running. And what that allowed us to do is it allowed us to find the seasonality of each of the species, or generally how often they were calling throughout the entire study period. The second thing I looked at was detection rates, and this is done using formula work for each of the different sites that we found. We looked at the total number of detections of a certain species over the total number of days the site was running for. And what this allows to do is it allows to determine the chances of a false negative in the study. So generally, by finding a false negative, we wanted to make sure that if we classified a site as not having an anurans species, for some reason, if they were not detected in the site, it was because they actually were not present in the site, compared to the false negative chance they might not have called at the same time I recorded, or I might not have heard them in the recordings. So by doing this, we were able to classify sites as either a present site or an absent site based on if an anurans species was in them or not, to compare for different factors within the independent variables to compare why an independent variable might have some species in the site compared to not in the site. So that's exactly what we did for looking at the independent variables compared to the main dependent variables that we looked at. The first dependent variable that we looked at was species richness, which is measured in Poisson regression. And then we looked at the presence of each of the different species that we found using logistic regression. And then again, that was just compared to the two independent variables, so size, which in our measurements was log transformed, and then the type of pond site we used, which is either a vernal pool or a permanent wetland. Finally, models were evaluated using AICC scores, and what this allows us to do is it allows us to compare different models. Generally, we compared a covariate model that did not, was not affected by the independent variables, compared to different models that did, covariate models that were affected by the independent variable, compared to an intercept-only model that was not affected by it. So the four models that we chose was an intercept-only model that had no relationship to the independent variable, size, type, and size and type combined. So moving on to our results, this is the first result. You can see it was the different proportions of all the species to find their seasonalities over time. As you can see, there were 7 total species that we found in the study: the gray tree frog, spring peeper, wood frog, pickerel frog, American toad, green frog, and bullfrog. Some interesting things to know about this is that the spring peeper had very high seasonality, especially at the start of the recording period. It had very high proportions, but it generally stopped calling near the end, or start of June and end of May. The American toad, green frog, and bullfrog were all species that had very low seasonalities throughout, but they generally started increasing calling proportions near the end of the recording period. So because of that, we believe that their seasonality might go further on past when we stopped recording on June 18th. So for future research, we might have to record past that. Moving on to the AIC scores of the different dependent variables. As you can see here, richness, general species richness in the area, the presence rates of gray tree frogs and wood frogs, all were dependent variables that had no relationship to the independent variables. The American toad and pickerel frog and their presence rates did have a meaningful relationship to both size and type, and the green frog, bullfrog, and spring peeper all had just a meaningful relationship to size. So moving on to the two species that we saw had a meaningful relationship to type. As you can see, comparing the beta scores for a wetland and a vernal pool, the American toad and pickerel frog both massively preferred wetlands. As you can see, it had a very positive beta score for wetlands and a very negative one for vernal pools. This is mainly because both the American toad and pickerel frog were actually only found within wetlands in the study period, which accounts for why the beta scores are so polarizing and why they massively preferred those. Moving on to size, as you can see, 4 out of the 5 species had a positive beta score for area, which meant that as pond size increased, so too did the presence rates of these 4 species, while the American toad was the only species that was an outlier. As pond size increased, its beta score decreased, so it had less presence rates. So moving on to implications from our results. First, we found 7 total anurans species in the study again, as you can see there. What's interesting to note about this is that the eastern cricket, upland chorus, and northern leopard frog were all species that we believe would be found within the study based on previous surveys in the past of NENHC, but they were not found using this acoustic monitoring method. So as a result, we either believe that they might not be present within NENHC anymore, or I might not have found them at the same times if they had different seasonalities, or they might not have called as often. We also saw that each of the 7 species that we did find have had very different seasonalities throughout the study. So the spring peepers had the highest detection rates, especially at the start. They had a very high seasonality, so we believe that the time in which we recorded overlapped very well with their seasonality. And then the American toad, green frog, and bullfrog, since they all called very little, we believe that their seasonalities might go past when we recorded, so we might have to record them in the future and increase our recording dates for future acoustic monitoring research. Then moving on to our independent variables, we saw that pond size had a very meaningful relationship to 5 of the total out of the 7 anurans species that we found. And larger pond sizes led to greater presence within 4 of these species. That's pretty interesting to note, especially when you compared it to the study in our review of literature that I mentioned, which saw that pond sizes above 4,000 square meters would be generally negative for most of the species that we found. But using this, we saw that it actually increased their calling rates, so it offers a different perspective. And then the American toad, gray tree frog, and wood frog, in addition to the pickerel frog, are all considered much more terrestrial frogs compared to other ones. And if you'll remember, the American toad was a species that had a negative relationship to pond size increasing, and the great tree frog and wood frog had no relationship, so that might be why that might be the case. Moving on to pond type, we saw it had a meaningful relationship to two of the anuran species that we found, which is the American toad and pickerel frog. What's interesting to note about this again is that they were only found within wetlands, which is why their beta scores were so high for wetlands and so low for vernal pools. And like I mentioned, the American toad, in addition to pickerel frog, are both subjects that are also more terrestrial compared to other anuran species. And since the wetlands in our study were more subject to change than the vernal pools during the summer, we believe that's why that might be the case. They were more adapted to move to different land environments if they had to for wetlands. But generally, all sites were able to work and monitor anurans using just acoustic monitoring as the only method of monitoring in the study. We didn't use any field methods. So as a result, we saw it was a reliable study strategy for recording anurans in the area, and it will be the main method of monitoring for future research with NINS for anuran species. With that, I'd like to thank my science research mentor in his institution, my science research teachers, and then my friends, family, and peers. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alex. We have time for questions.
Yes.
Did you divide out if you were hearing individual calls or choruses?
We just looked at certain, anytime that there was a species called in a recording, we marked that down as they were calling during that time. Because it was very hard to find individual species during a chorus, so it was generally just how often they were calling for specific grades.
Do you have some ideas for why pond size might be negatively related to the rates that brought in call?
Do you mean for the American toads, or?
Yeah, the one that you found in the other studies.
For our study, we believe that American toads were the only species that did have a negative relationship. Generally, American toads are more terrestrial than the other 4 species that we found. So we believe that since they're less reliant on the water and they often prefer land, bigger pond sizes would negatively impact them since they prefer land. For the other study, they actually monitored a few different things in their study as well, sort of species density, as well as since we just monitored species richness. So different monitoring strategies might be the reason why they might have different results.
Wood frogs. You had a graph that had a U shape
Yeah.
on it, and you didn't really talk about that. I was wondering, and why aren't they more biased towards small vernal pools too?
Yeah, so for vernal pools, wood frogs aren't really as terrestrial, I believe, as some of the other species, so that might be why they didn't have as impactful relationship, but also, they are a bit more terrestrial. For their graph, as you can see, yeah, it's kind of a U shape, where their seasonality sort of increases at the start and increases at the end. I didn't really touch on this because I didn't go into too much research on it, but one thing I might have thought about was that one theory I might have is that they might call less often when there's a lot of species calling at the same time. So near the start of recordings, when it's only really spring peepers and wood frogs, that might be why they start calling the most. And then at the end, when spring peepers stop calling, that's why they might reappear.
Wood frogs usually have a very short breeding season compared to spring peepers are 2 months, and wood frogs can be 1 or 2 days the whole season sometimes. So, but maybe because they start calling when it snows, then they start calling again after it melts again.
Yeah, there's a lot of different reasons that might be the case. Yeah. Yes.
So do these species call it, do anything call it more at different times of day than others, like morning or when it gets warmer, and could that affect some of these detections and the species you didn't detect at all?
I didn't particularly notice that on the site. That wasn't really something I monitored. I would say that just generally at the ends of recordings at I think 6 a.m. in every recording, that's when birds started to call. So then a lot of species didn't call as often then. So I'm not exactly sure on the different ones, but that's why they mainly call between 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. Yeah.
So you didn't record during the day? Because in our area, spring peepers are calling, when it's warm in early spring, they're calling continuously all day.
Yeah, just generally for the recorders to save on battery life and other reasons, we generally looked at the times where we thought they would most often call, which was between 6 p.m. to 6 a.m.
Okay.
Or just generally probably because of birds as well. It might have been a bit harder to hear them, so that's why we chose the time we did. Yeah.
I'm just curious, with bat work, you can kind of look at the shape of calls. I was wondering if you kind of looked at distinguishable shapes of different species.
Yeah, so in spectrum, I just thought I didn't really show a really zoomed in like version, you are able to zoom in on the application that I used. And yeah, like generally like there, you can only really see like where it is, but like if you zoom in very close, like it does have a very specific call. So that's also how we were able to identify the species even better.
More questions? All right, let's thank Alex one more time.